The door didn't close gently. It slammed with the kind of force that makes everyone in the room freeze for just a second, unsure of what they just witnessed. Prince Harry was already gone before most people could even process what had happened. No carefully worded statement for the waiting press, no acknowledgement of the cameras lined up outside like vultures on a wire, no measured response crafted by his legal team to soften the blow, just silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. And in that silence you could feel something breaking. Monday, in the highest court the United Kingdom has to offer, Prince Harry's final legal battle against Britain's tabloid empire came to an abrupt and brutal end. Not with the vindication he'd spent years fighting for, not with the justice he believed was owed to him, but with a ruling that landed like a hammer blow to the chest. And if you were paying close attention, if you understood what this case truly meant to him on a personal level, you could see the exact moment hope died in his eyes. So let me ask you something that matters. What do you do when the system you're begging for help is the same system that's already decided it won't save you? Because that's exactly where Prince Harry found himself standing on Monday afternoon, in a courtroom that had just told him, in the most detached and clinical language imaginable, that his claim came too late, that his evidence wasn't sufficient, that the law does not bend simply because you need it to, and for a man who has spent the better part of a decade trying to hold the British media accountable for what he describes as surveillance, manipulation, invasion, and psychological warfare, that wasn't just a legal setback, that was the end of the road. But here's the part nobody's talking about yet. The part that makes this story so much bigger than just one man losing one court case. This wasn't simply about phone hacking or sensational tabloid headlines. This was about Prince Harry trying to prove, once and for all, that he wasn't paranoid, that the cameras really were following him everywhere, that the intrusion into his life was real, measurable, and devastating. He wanted the British judiciary to look at the mountain of evidence he'd compiled and say clearly, unambiguously, yes, you were wronged. Instead, what they said was far more crushing. They said, we don't have jurisdiction over your pain. So the question becomes unavoidable. If the courts won't listen, if the legal system refuses to acknowledge what happened, who will? And perhaps more importantly, what does Prince Harry do now? Where does he go from here when every door has been slammed shut? Let's rewind for a moment because we need to understand the stakes. This wasn't just another celebrity lawsuit filed by someone with too much money and too much time. This wasn't about protecting a carefully managed public image or winning a financial settlement. This was, in Harry's own words during previous testimony, the crusade of his life. This was deeply, painfully personal in ways most people can't fully comprehend. The list of legal battles he's fought is long and complicated. The accusations are serious, spanning years of alleged misconduct by British tabloids, and some of those cases he's won. In 2023, he secured what felt like a landmark victory against Mirror Group newspapers. A judge ruled definitively that phone hacking had indeed occurred, that Harry's privacy had been violated, and awarded him damages. That victory felt like validation. It felt like proof that he'd been telling the truth all along, that he wasn't crazy, that the surveillance and intrusion he'd described for years had actually happened. But this case, the one that ended Monday, was supposed to be different. This was supposed to be the clean shot, the final reckoning. The case that would force the British legal system to acknowledge in black and white the systematic pattern of abuse he's been describing since he was old enough to understand what was happening to him. Instead, it didn't just fail, it collapsed. And it's not simply that he lost, it's how he lost. Because here's what we're hearing from legal analysts who were present and from sources inside that courtroom. The judges didn't outright reject the idea that wrongdoing may have occurred. They weren't saying Harry was lying about what happened to him. They weren't declaring the press innocent. They were saying something far more devastating than any of that. They were saying, even if everything you're claiming is true, even if every allegation is accurate, we can't help you. The law doesn't extend that far. The statute of limitations has passed. The evidence, while compelling, doesn't meet the specific legal standard required. Think about that for a second. Really let it sink in. Imagine spending years of your life building a case, gathering evidence from multiple sources, reliving trauma every single time you sit down with your lawyers, dragging yourself back to the country that's treated you like a target since you were a child, only to be told that's not justice. That's a dismissal. And if you had been sitting in that courtroom on Monday, watching Harry's face as the ruling was read aloud in that flat, emotionless tone judges use, you would have seen it. the precise moment when the realization hit him like cold water. This isn't going to end the way I thought it would. This fight is over. Now think about the years that led to this single moment. The testimonies he gave, opening himself up to cross-examination. The depositions where he had to recount painful memories in excruciating detail. The endless legal briefs his team filed, each one representing hours of work and strategy. Harry stood in witness boxes during previous trials and spoke openly, even vulnerably, about what it felt like to be hunted by the press from childhood onward. He talked about panic attacks that left him unable to breathe, about not knowing who to trust because anyone could be feeding information to tabloids, about finding tracking devices on his car and wondering how many more he hadn't found. He described a life where every phone call felt monitored, where every relationship, romantic or otherwise, felt exposed before it even had a chance to develop naturally, where every private moment, every vulnerable conversation, every mistake became public property within hours. But the law doesn't work on feelings. The law doesn't care how traumatized you are. It cares about what you can prove within very specific parameters. And on Monday, the court decided he hadn't proven enough within those narrow legal boundaries. So why did he come back? That's the question everyone keeps asking, and it's a valid one. Because this wasn't just a return to London for a court appearance. This was a return to the lion's den. Prince Harry hasn't lived in the United Kingdom full-time since 2020. He stepped back from royal duties in what the press called Megxit. He moved across an ocean to California with Meghan and their children. He built an entirely new life far from the scrutiny, the protocols, and the suffocating structure of the British monarchy. But for this case, he came back. He walked directly into the same arena that has spent decades twisting his image, reshaping his narrative into something he no longer recognizes, and by all accounts refusing to listen the first time he asked for help. Why risk it? Why put himself through that again? Because that's what this was. A massive risk. Not a calculated public relations move, not a ceremonial appearance to satisfy some legal requirement. This was Prince Harry rolling the dice one last time, hoping against hope that maybe this court would be different, that maybe this time someone in power would actually listen. But even before he stepped through those courthouse doors Monday morning, the cracks were already showing. You could see it in the way his legal team gathered that morning outside the building, huddled close together, speaking in low, tense voices, not strategizing anymore. That time had passed. They were bracing for impact. You could feel it in the crowd that had gathered outside, smaller than before, less supportive, more skeptical, more cynical. The public sentiment had shifted over the years. Where once there was genuine sympathy, especially after his raw revelations about mental health struggles and the lasting trauma of his mother's death, now there was fatigue. People were tired of the lawsuits that seemed never-ending, tired of the headlines that made Harry look either like a crusader or a complainer depending on which newspaper you read. Tired of what they saw as a privileged man with immense wealth complaining about problems most ordinary people would never face in their entire lives. And you could sense it in Harry himself if you were watching closely. The shoulders weren't squared with confidence this time. The eyes didn't scan the crowd or the press with defiance. This wasn't the posture of someone ready for battle. This was something quieter, something heavier. A man walking into what might very well be his final shot at being heard, and knowing deep down that the odds were not in his favor. And here's where the location becomes critically important. This wasn't some lower court where cases get reheard and appealed routinely. This wasn't a preliminary hearing where procedural matters get sorted out. This was the United Kingdom's highest court, the kind of place where legal precedent is everything, where procedure rules absolutely, where emotion, no matter how genuine or justified, has no place in the decision-making process. There's no jury to sway with compelling personal testimony, no public gallery to win over with passionate speeches about injustice. Just law. Cold, impartial, unforgiving law applied through centuries of precedent and rigid interpretation. And that's the fundamental contradiction nobody wanted to acknowledge out loud. Prince Harry was asking the very institution he had come to deeply distrust, the British establishment, to now defend him, to validate his lived experience. To tell the public clearly and officially he wasn't paranoid. He was right. But that kind of contradiction doesn't hold together for long under pressure. Because behind those ancient walls and beneath those formal robes, the judges weren't interested in personal redemption stories. They weren't moved by narratives of suffering. They were measuring law against statute, precedent against procedure, historical interpretation against current application. And the moment oral arguments began Monday morning, it became painfully clear to everyone watching they weren't bending, not even slightly. Think about what it actually takes to walk back into a system that has repeatedly, consistently told you no, to stand in front of judges who have already signaled through procedural rulings and preliminary decisions that they're deeply skeptical of your claims, to know with absolute certainty that the press, the very institution you're fighting against, is watching every single move you make, recording every expression, ready to write tomorrow's headlines before you've even left the building, ready to spin the story in whichever direction serves their narrative. That takes either tremendous courage or desperate hope, and in Harry's case, watching him walk into that courthouse Monday morning, it might have been both. There's a moment in every trial, and lawyers will tell you this, where you can feel the energy in the room fundamentally change. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, there's no sudden outburst or shocking revelation, but if you've spent any time in courtrooms, if you've watched enough cases unfold, you know exactly what it looks like. The judges stop asking clarifying questions. The tone becomes purely procedural. The faces at the bench, which might have shown some engagement earlier, go completely still and unreadable. That's when you know. That's when you understand the law is moving forward without you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And that's exactly what happened Monday afternoon. Prince Harry sat on one side of the courtroom, his legal team beside him, silent now, their expressions carefully controlled but readable if you knew what to look for. Across from them sat a judiciary that had already begun to emotionally and intellectually pull away from the case. Because here's the thing about courts, especially at this level of the system, they are not designed to be moved by passion. They're not built to empathize with suffering. They're designed to interpret law in a detached, disciplined manner that prioritizes consistency and precedent over individual circumstances. That's how the system survives across generations and changing social attitudes. But Harry wasn't built for detachment, not in this fight, not after everything he'd been through. This case wasn't just legal theory to him, it wasn't an intellectual exercise, it was deeply, fundamentally personal. His written submissions, the documents his legal team filed, spoke of betrayal at the highest levels, of invasion that never stopped, of psychological harm that compounded over decades. He wasn't asking for sympathy directly. He's too proud for that. But he was asking for acknowledgement. He wanted someone in a position of power and authority to finally say clearly, yes, you were wronged, you were watched, you were manipulated, your privacy was violated systematically. But that isn't what the law gave him Monday. The judges, by every account from people present, remained laser-focused and clinical throughout. They didn't dispute the theoretical possibility that the press had overstepped boundaries in the past. They didn't question Harry's sincerity or his belief that harm had occurred. But they questioned relentlessly whether this specific claim, this final legal battle, met the precise burden of proof required by law. Had it been filed too late under statute of limitations? Did it rely too heavily on circumstantial evidence rather than direct proof? Was it built on reasonable inferences or mere assumptions? They weren't debating morality or ethics, they were defining legal boundaries with surgical precision. And this is where the tension in that courtroom grew thick enough to cut. Because across the aisle, Harry's legal team began leaning harder into broader arguments. They started painting with wider brushstrokes, talking about patterns of abuse across the entire tabloid industry, about a culture of exploitation that went far beyond any single incident, about journalists who broke the law not occasionally but systematically as standard operating procedure, about editors who knew exactly what was happening and deliberately turned a blind eye because the stories sold newspapers and generated clicks. They were trying to shift the frame, to make this about something bigger than technical legal requirements. But the judges kept narrowing their gaze, as if to say without words, that's not why we're here. That's not the question before this court. And if you were watching Harry's face carefully during this exchange, you could see the discomfort rising. The way he shifted slightly in his chair, the small, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He wasn't interrupting. He's been trained since childhood never to interrupt in formal settings. He wasn't gesturing or trying to communicate with his legal team, but there was something in his posture, something unsettled, a growing recognition, perhaps, that the emotional core of his entire argument was dissolving under cold legal scrutiny. One observer who was present in the courtroom later described it to journalists as watching someone realize in real time that the rules of the game had fundamentally changed, and nobody had bothered to tell him until it was too late to adjust strategy. And then it happened. The moment that, according to multiple sources, seemed to drain the remaining hope from the room. One of the justices asked a question. It was brief, technical, focused on a specific point of law. But it landed like a physical blow because the question wasn't about truth. It wasn't about whether Harry's claims were accurate. It was about timing, whether this case, regardless of its merit, had come too late to matter under law, the statute of limitations, the question of when Harry knew, or more precisely, when the court believed he should have known about the alleged wrongdoing, the issue of whether he'd waited too long to bring his claim forward. And Harry looked down, not in defeat exactly, but in something arguably worse. Disbelief. Because in that single moment, it hit him with full force. The court wasn't doubting that harm had occurred. They weren't questioning whether he'd suffered. They were questioning whether they could still care from a legal standpoint. The law has time limits built into its very structure, and according to the judge's interpretation, Harry had run out of time. It didn't matter that the psychological trauma was ongoing. It didn't matter that the full impact had taken years to understand and process. It didn't matter that uncovering evidence of systematic surveillance required time and resources. What mattered? The only thing that mattered in this courtroom was the calendar, the dates, the procedural deadlines written into statute decades ago. And on that measure, by that standard, Harry had lost before he even began. The ruling itself came down exactly as you'd expect from a system trained to never show emotion. Delivered in the neutral, measured cadence of judges who've spent careers learning to never flinch regardless of what they're deciding. Dry, procedural, utterly emotionless. Prince Harry didn't react outwardly, at least not in the way some observers expected or perhaps hoped for. No outburst of anger, no visible flash of rage, just a stillness that somehow felt louder than any words. But the silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Because this wasn't just another unfavorable ruling in a long series of legal battles, this was final. The absolute end of a legal journey that had stretched across years, across continents, through countless layers of emotional and psychological terrain. And when the justices confirmed in careful legal language that they would not expand legal protections in the way Harry had hoped, would not in fact alter the established legal framework around press intrusion and privacy rights, it became undeniably clear. The system had spoken its final word, and it wasn't going to bend. Not for a prince, not for a husband trying to protect his family, not even for a son trying to prevent what happened to his mother from happening again to the people he loves. The written judgment, released shortly after the oral ruling concluded, was dense with legal reasoning. Pages and pages of statutory interpretation, case law analysis stretching back decades, procedural considerations examined from every angle. But buried somewhere in all that impenetrable legal language was a message simple enough for anyone to understand. We acknowledge your concerns. We understand you believe harm occurred. But changing the law to accommodate your particular situation would create precedents we're simply not willing to set. In other words, your suffering, while perhaps real, is not our legal problem to solve. Let me ask you something honest. Have you ever fought for something with absolutely everything you had, poured years of your life into it, invested not just money, but emotional energy you'll never get back, only to be told in the end that it wasn't enough? That's exactly what this was for Harry. Years of grueling effort, millions of pounds in legal fees, emotional capital he'll never recover. And in return, a polite bureaucratic rejection. The walkout wasn't slow and measured. It wasn't a dignified, controlled exit stage managed by PR professionals. It was abrupt, like something internal had suddenly given way. Harry left that courtroom before most reporters even fully registered what was happening. 1 second, he was seated behind the defendant's table, surrounded by a wall of legal documents and quiet, last-minute conversations with his team. The next second, he was simply gone. Some journalists who've covered royal stories for decades described the look on his face as thunderous. Others said it was completely hollow, emptied out. One reporter who's followed Harry's journey since childhood said it reminded them viscerally of the expression on his face during his mother's funeral, that same devastating mixture of grief and fury and absolute helplessness. But here's the part where accounts diverge and nobody can quite agree on interpretation. What does this actually mean going forward? Because if this truly was Harry's last major legal attempt to hold the media accountable for what he perceives as years of surveillance, manipulation, and psychological warfare, then a door hasn't just closed. It's been locked and the key thrown away. He could theoretically appeal, yes, his legal team could file motions, but insiders familiar with the British legal system say the odds of success are razor thin at best. And even if he tried to refile under a different legal theory or claim, the appetite from the judiciary is clearly waning. That's the quiet part, the part that doesn't appear in official judgments but lives between the lines for anyone trained to read them. The part that says clearly, we've heard enough from Prince Harry. The system has made its decision. It's time to move on. What nobody saw coming, what caught even experienced royal watchers off guard, was what happened immediately after. Because the exit wasn't just abrupt, it was angry in a way Harry rarely allows himself to be in public. According to multiple sources who were physically present, Harry didn't just leave, he stormed out with visible emotion. His legal team, caught off guard, had to scramble to follow him. Security personnel had to adjust their carefully planned procedures on the fly, and the meticulously crafted exit strategy, the one designed weeks in advance to manage optics and control the narrative regardless of outcome, was completely abandoned in that moment. But here's what makes this moment historically significant beyond just one man's emotional reaction. Prince Harry has spent the better part of a decade trying painstakingly to control his public image, trying to appear measured, reasonable, justified in his grievances against the system. He's given carefully prepared interviews with major outlets, he's worked closely with expensive public relations teams, he's tried consistently to position himself as the rational truth-teller fighting against an irrational, corrupt system. But on Monday afternoon, all of that careful construction fell away completely. What the world saw wasn't the polished prince. It wasn't the media-trained royal who knows exactly which camera to look at. It was raw, unfiltered emotion, pure frustration boiling over. The kind of anger that comes from years, maybe decades, of feeling fundamentally unheard, systematically dismissed, and deliberately gaslighted by institutions that claim to serve justice. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Maybe that's the most honest we've ever actually seen him, because everything else, all the carefully staged interviews, the documentary series, the memoir written with professional ghostwriters, those were all filtered through lawyers and publicists and brand managers thinking 3 moves ahead. But that moment in the courtroom Monday, that split second when control slipped, that was real. That was a man who'd just been told for what he knows is the final time that his pain, his trauma, his lived experience simply doesn't matter to the people with power to do something about it. Think carefully about what that does to a person psychologically. You spend years, perhaps your entire adult life, believing deeply that if you just explain it clearly enough, if you just present sufficient evidence, if you just show people exactly what really happened behind closed doors, they'll finally understand. They'll validate your experience. They'll acknowledge the harm that was done. And then you get all the way to the highest court in the entire country, you present your case as thoroughly as humanly possible, and they look at you and say with complete detachment, "We believe something probably happened to you. We just don't care enough to do anything about it." How does a person come back from that kind of institutional rejection? Outside the courthouse, the scene devolved into barely controlled chaos within seconds. Photographers who'd been waiting for hours swarmed forward as one mass. Reporters shouted questions over each other, their voices blending into incomprehensible noise. Security formed a tight, aggressive perimeter around Harry as he moved with clear purpose toward his waiting vehicle. Head down, jaw visibly clenched, moving like someone who needed to be anywhere but there. One photographer who's been covering Harry for 15 years told colleagues later, "I've photographed that man in war zones, at his brother's wedding, at his grandmother's funeral. I have never, ever seen him look like that. He looked completely done." And maybe that single word captures this moment better than any detailed analysis could. Done. Just utterly done. Done fighting a system that has proven repeatedly it won't fight for him. Done trying to convince people who made up their minds about him years ago and refused to reconsider. Done seeking justice from institutions that actively profit from injustice. Done playing by rules that were designed from the beginning to protect power rather than truth. Just done. So where does that leave him now? That's the real question facing everyone who's followed this story. if the courts are definitively no longer an option, if legal mechanisms have proven themselves insufficient or unwilling to address what Harry insists is a systematic pattern of violation, what's actually left? Does he pivot to public campaigns, launching media exposés that bypass traditional legal channels entirely? Does he fund documentaries that lay out evidence the courts refuse to consider? Does he write another book, even more revealing than the last? Or worse, from the monarchy's perspective, does he completely withdraw from institutional engagement altogether? Because here's what one source close to the case quietly suggested off the record to journalists. The plan was never to walk away from this fight entirely. Harry genuinely believed, right up until Monday afternoon, that persistence would eventually break through institutional resistance. But after this verdict, after this final rejection, he may actually be forced to abandon the entire approach he's pursued for years. And if that happens, if Prince Harry truly and completely turns his back on the British legal system and the institutions connected to it, then what happens next won't be confined to courtrooms and legal filings. It'll spill into public opinion in unpredictable ways. It'll affect family dynamics that are already strained to breaking point. It'll shape the legacy he's desperately trying to build for his children, who will one day read about all of this and form their own judgments. Because this was never just a legal fight in Harry's mind, it was fundamentally a moral one. And when you lose a moral fight inside a system that explicitly claims to uphold justice and fairness, that's not just disappointing in the way losing normally is. That's destabilizing to your entire worldview. Think honestly about what Harry has sacrificed to get to this point. He's become estranged from virtually his entire family. King Charles, his own father, reportedly hasn't spoken to him in months despite being diagnosed with cancer. Prince William, his only sibling and once his closest friend, allegedly won't take his calls under any circumstances. He's been systematically vilified in the British press for years, portrayed variously as ungrateful, entitled, manipulative, mentally unstable, controlled by his wife. He's lost military titles that meant the world to someone who served in combat. He's lost patronages and ceremonial roles he genuinely cared about. He moved his entire life across the world to California, 10,000 miles from the only home he'd ever known. And he did absolutely all of that believing, truly believing with everything he had, that one day the system would acknowledge what was done to him. That one day a judge would look at the evidence objectively and say clearly, you were right about what happened, and we're genuinely sorry it took this long to recognize. But that day didn't come Monday. And deep down, Harry now knows it's never coming. So now he stands at a genuine crossroads with no clear path forward. Does he keep fighting through other means? Does he escalate publicly in ways that make his previous revelations look tame? Does he write another memoir, give another bombshell interview, launch another public campaign that puts even more distance between himself and the institution he was born into? Or does he finally, after all these years, just let it go? Some people close to him, speaking carefully to journalists on background, say he's genuinely considering a complete media blackout. No more interviews of any kind. No more court cases or legal battles. No more public confrontations with the establishment. Just silence. A complete retreat into private life, focusing exclusively on his family, his children's upbringing, his charitable work, his mental health advocacy, all of it conducted far away from the spotlight that has caused him so much documented pain. But here's what we know with absolute certainty based on multiple accounts from Monday. Something fundamental broke inside that courtroom. Whether it was Harry's faith in British institutions, his willingness to engage with systems that have repeatedly rejected him, or simply his patience after years of fighting, something essential shifted. And the man who walked out of that courthouse Monday afternoon is not the same man who walked in that morning with fragile hope still alive. Now let's zoom out for a moment, because this story is so much bigger than just Prince Harry's personal journey. Whether you support him or think he's completely wrong, whether you believe his complaints are justified or think he's privileged and out of touch, this case revealed something deeply uncomfortable about the relationship between power, media, and accountability in modern democracies. It revealed that even when you have substantial resources, compelling evidence, and significant public sympathy, you can still lose completely. Not because you were wrong about the facts, not because your claims were baseless, but because the system fundamentally doesn't want to set a precedent that might limit its own power or the power of institutions it protects. And that should genuinely concern all of us, regardless of how we feel about royalty. Because if a prince, someone with enormous wealth, access to top legal teams, and global media visibility, can't get justice against media overreach and privacy violations, what possible chance does an ordinary person have? This case wasn't really just about Harry's privacy in isolation. It was about whether privacy as a concept still exists in any meaningful way in an age of surveillance capitalism, algorithmic journalism, and 24/7 media cycles that never sleep. It was about whether legal systems designed in previous centuries can possibly keep up with technology that evolves faster than legislation. It was about whether courts can realistically protect individuals from powerful institutions that profit enormously from exposure and intrusion. And the answer, at least in this case, at least for now, seems to be a resounding no. The system is too slow, too rigid, too invested in maintaining existing power structures and the status quo. Think about the precedent this actually sets going forward. If the highest court in the United Kingdom won't hold media companies accountable for allegedly unlawful surveillance, even when evidence exists, even when documented harm is presented, even when the victim has resources to fight, then what message does that send to everyone else? It tells media organizations explicitly, keep doing exactly what you're doing. The law won't stop you as long as you're careful about timing and technical details. It tells victims of media harassment, don't bother fighting back. You'll exhaust yourself emotionally and financially and lose anyway. It tells the general public, privacy is effectively dead. Get used to it. Oozed. And that's genuinely terrifying when you think through the implications, because this isn't just about celebrities or royals or public figures who chose fame. This is about every single person who's ever had their phone hacked without consent, their emails read by people who had no right, their private life exposed publicly without any agreement. This is about the teenager whose intimate photos get shared online without permission. This is about the whistleblower whose identity gets leaked to the people they're exposing. This is about the ordinary citizen who becomes a target of media harassment for any reason and discovers they have absolutely nowhere to turn for protection. If the system won't protect Prince Harry with all his advantages, it certainly won't protect them. And maybe that's the real tragedy here that nobody wants to say out loud. Not that Harry lost his case, but that his loss means everyone else loses too. Let's not lose sight of something crucial. Behind all the complicated legal language, behind the sensational headlines and the political debates, there's a human being. A man who lost his mother when he was just 12 years old. A man who grew up in literally the most scrutinized environment that exists anywhere on Earth. A man who served his country in Afghanistan, facing real danger, only to come home and be treated like a commodity by the same press that claims to celebrate military service. Prince Harry is not perfect. He's made mistakes he probably regrets. He's said things in anger that maybe he wishes he could take back. But he's also a father trying to protect his children, a husband trying to shield his wife, a son still actively grieving losses that never fully heal. And when you strip away all the titles and the inherited privilege and the public controversy, what you're left with is someone who simply wanted to be heard, who wanted someone, anyone in a position of authority, to acknowledge that what happened to him was wrong, and they didn't. They refused. Think about the psychological toll that takes on a person, to fight for years, to expose your deepest trauma publicly in legal depositions, to relive the absolute worst moments of your life in witness statements that become public record, only to have a court tell you clinically that none of it matters enough to act. That's not just a legal defeat you recover from. That's a personal rejection that changes how you see the world. And for someone like Harry, who's been painfully open about his struggles with mental health, who's talked publicly about therapy and PTSD and the lasting impact of childhood trauma, this could be genuinely devastating in ways we won't see for months or years. So what happens now for him personally? Does he retreat into complete silence, as some suggest? Does he double down and fight even harder through non-legal means? Does he find another platform to tell his story? Or does he finally reach acceptance that some battles simply cannot be won, no matter how hard you fight or how right you are? The silence that remains is perhaps the loudest part of this entire story. He didn't say a single word as he left the courtroom. No dramatic statement for the cameras, no defiant glance toward the press, just a visible flash of tension in his jaw, a heaviness in his posture that spoke louder than any words could. Then the door closed behind him with that heavy final sound, and with that it was over. But here's the thing about endings that anyone who's lived through real loss understands. They're never really the end. They're just transformations into something else. Because Prince Harry's fight, whether he personally continues it or not, has already fundamentally changed the conversation in ways that can't be undone. It's forced society to ask much harder questions about privacy, power, and accountability than we were asking before. It's exposed the structural limits of legal systems when it comes to protecting individuals from institutional harm. And it's reminded everyone watching that even princes, people born into ultimate privilege, can be completely powerless when systems decide not to help them. The courtroom may have closed its doors permanently on Harry's case, but the larger questions remain wide open and unresolved. How do we actually balance press freedom, which matters in democracies, with individual privacy, which also matters? How do we hold powerful institutions accountable when the legal system actively refuses to? How do we protect people, all people regardless of status, from surveillance and harassment in the digital age where technology outpaces law? These aren't easy questions with simple answers, but they're questions we desperately need to keep asking. Because what happened to Prince Harry on Monday wasn't really just about him personally. It was about all of us, about what kind of society we want to live in, about the values we claim to uphold, about whether justice is truly blind or just blind to certain kinds of suffering that don't fit neat legal categories. So if you've been following this case closely, if you have genuine thoughts about what this ruling really means, not just for Prince Harry, but for privacy rights, for institutional accountability, and for the legacy we're creating, leave a comment. Tell us what you saw that others might have missed. Do you think Harry was right to fight this battle for as long as he did, or do you think it was time to let it go years ago? Do you believe the courts made the right legal decision even if it feels wrong morally? Or do you think they failed to protect someone who genuinely needed protection from institutional power? And if you want to follow what comes next, because this story is absolutely far from over despite what the court said, make sure you're subscribed. Because the silence we're hearing right now, it's only just begun. And in that silence, something is building. Whether it's acceptance or rage, peace or revolution, closure or an entirely new chapter, we don't know yet. Nobody does. But we'll be watching closely. Because Prince Harry's story isn't over. It's just entered a completely new phase. One without courtrooms, one without judges in robes, one where the only verdict that truly matters is his own. And whatever he decides, it's going to reshape not just his life, but the entire conversation about power, privacy, and justice in ways we're only beginning to understand. The weight of Monday's ruling extends far beyond the immediate legal outcome. According to constitutional experts and longtime royal observers, what happened in that courtroom represents a pivotal moment not just for Prince Harry personally, but for the entire institution of monarchy in the 21st century. Because here's what nobody's saying directly, but everyone's thinking. This wasn't just a prince losing a court case. This was a fundamental test of whether someone born into the ultimate position of privilege can ever truly be vulnerable in the eyes of the law. And the answer the British legal system delivered was complex and troubling. On one hand, the ruling proves that even royalty must follow the same legal procedures and limitations as everyone else. Harry wasn't given special treatment. He wasn't allowed to bypass rules about timing and evidence standards just because of who he is. In that sense, the system worked exactly as it's supposed to, treating everyone equally under the law, regardless of status. But on the other hand, that same equality reveals something darker. If the system can't or won't protect someone with Harry's resources and visibility, it's essentially admitting it can't protect anyone from institutional media power. And that's a confession of impotence that should worry everyone who believes in justice. According to legal scholars who've analyzed the written judgment, the court was remarkably careful in its language. They didn't dismiss Harry's claims as baseless or frivolous. They didn't question his sincerity or suggest he was lying about his experiences. What they did instead was hide behind procedure. They pointed to technicalities, to timing issues, to evidentiary standards that are nearly impossible to meet when you're trying to prove systematic surveillance that was designed specifically to avoid leaving clear evidence. In other words, they found a way to say no without actually calling Harry wrong, and that might be the most damning part of all. Think about what this means for journalism and media accountability going forward. If tabloids and news organizations now understand that even the most high-profile target, someone with unlimited legal resources and public sympathy, couldn't successfully hold them accountable for privacy violations, what's to stop them from pushing even harder? What's to prevent even more aggressive tactics? The answer, based on Monday's ruling, appears to be nothing at all. The legal system has essentially given them a green light, intentionally or not, to continue operating exactly as they have been. Some media ethics experts argue this creates a dangerous precedent that will echo for decades. According to their analysis, Monday's ruling doesn't just affect Prince Harry, it affects every public figure, every person who enters public life, every individual who becomes newsworthy for any reason. The court has essentially ruled that if you're in the public eye, your privacy protections are so limited and so difficult to enforce that they barely exist in any practical sense. You can be surveilled, followed, investigated, exposed, and there's very little legal recourse available to you. But perhaps the most profound impact will be on Prince Harry himself and how he moves forward from here. According to people who know him well, people who've worked with him on various projects over the years, Harry is someone who needs purpose. He needs to feel like he's fighting for something meaningful, something bigger than himself. The military gave him that for years. His charitable work, particularly around mental health and veterans issues, has provided that sense of purpose, and this legal battle, however exhausting, gave him a clear mission, a defined enemy, a tangible goal. Now that mission is gone. That clarity has been stripped away, and according to psychologists who specialize in trauma and loss, that kind of sudden absence of purpose after years of focused effort can be psychologically devastating. It's not just about losing the case. It's about losing the structure, the meaning, the sense that you're working towards something important. Harry now faces a void that he'll need to fill with something else, and what he chooses could determine the entire trajectory of the rest of his life. Will he channel his anger and frustration into activism, becoming an even more vocal critic of media practices and institutional failures? Some observers think that's the most likely path. He could use his platform, which remains substantial despite everything, to push for legislative changes that courts refuse to make. He could fund investigative journalism that exposes media practices from the inside. He could become a champion for privacy rights in the digital age, turning his personal loss into a broader movement. That would give him purpose again, and it would mean Monday's defeat wasn't the end, but rather a transformation of his fight from legal to political. Or will he do the opposite? Will he retreat completely, as some close to him suggest he's considering? Will he conclude that engaging with British institutions and British media in any form is pointless, that the system is too rigged, too invested in protecting itself to ever deliver real accountability? If he chooses that path, we might see Harry effectively disappear from public life in Britain, focusing entirely on his California existence, raising his children far from the chaos, and leaving his royal past behind as completely as possible. That would be a different kind of statement, one of exhausted resignation rather than continued defiance. There's a third possibility that some royal commentators think is most likely, a hybrid approach where Harry remains publicly engaged but on his own terms, never again seeking validation or justice from British institutions. He might continue speaking out, continue telling his story, continue advocating for causes he believes in, but without ever again expecting or asking for official acknowledgement or institutional support. That would represent a kind of independence that's rare for someone born into his position, a complete psychological separation from the need for establishment approval. Whatever he chooses, Monday marked an ending. The door that slammed wasn't just the courtroom exit, it was the closing of an entire chapter of Harry's life, one defined by hope that the system could be reformed from within, that persistence could overcome institutional resistance, that truth would eventually prevail in courts designed to find it. That hope is gone now, and what replaces it will define who Prince Harry becomes in the years ahead. The silence continues. The questions remain, and the world watches, waiting to see what a prince does when he finally stops fighting the system and starts deciding what comes next. What we witnessed Monday in that courtroom wasn't just a legal proceeding reaching its conclusion. According to historians who study the British monarchy and its evolution over centuries, it was something far more significant. It was a breaking point, a moment when the fundamental tension between modern expectations of accountability and ancient structures of privilege became impossible to ignore any longer, and Prince Harry, whether he intended to or not, has become the human embodiment of that tension, caught between two worlds that can't seem to coexist peacefully. The British monarchy has survived for over 1,000 years by adapting just enough to changing times while preserving its essential character. It survived the English Civil War, the execution of Charles I, and the temporary abolition of the Crown. It survived the loss of American colonies and the dissolution of the British Empire. It survived 2 world wars, the death of Princess Diana, and countless scandals that would have destroyed less resilient institutions. But according to constitutional experts, every one of those survival moments required the monarchy to read the room correctly, to understand when change was necessary to prevent complete collapse. The question now facing the institution is whether it understands the room today, whether King Charles and his advisors recognize that Monday's ruling, while technically a victory for the tabloids and the status quo, might actually represent a long-term strategic defeat for the monarchy itself. Because here's what the polling data shows, data that palace officials are undoubtedly studying carefully. Younger generations, particularly those under 40, increasingly see the Harry situation not as a privileged man complaining, but as someone being systematically failed by institutions that claim to protect people. That's a perception problem the monarchy can't afford. According to researchers who study generational attitudes toward traditional institutions, younger Britons and younger people globally are far less deferential to authority than previous generations. They don't automatically respect institutions just because they're old or traditional. They judge them by contemporary standards of fairness, transparency, and accountability. And by those standards, the way Harry has been treated, both by the media and now by the courts, looks increasingly indefensible. That creates a genuine crisis for an institution that depends on public support to justify its existence. Some royal commentators believe the monarchy is making a critical miscalculation. They're treating Harry as an individual problem, one wayward prince who can be isolated and waited out. But according to this analysis, Harry isn't the problem. He's a symptom. He represents broader questions about privilege, accountability, mental health, racism, and institutional reform that aren't going away just because one court case ended badly. And every time the institution fails to address those questions meaningfully, every time it hides behind procedure and tradition instead of confronting uncomfortable truths, it loses more credibility with the very people who will determine whether monarchy survives another generation. Think about the specific moment we're living in historically. This is an era of unprecedented transparency, where secrets are harder to keep than ever before, where institutions from churches to governments to corporations are being forced to confront past abuses and systemic failures, where the phrase, "that's how we've always done it," no longer functions as an adequate justification for anything. The monarchy exists in this environment, still claiming special privileges, still operating behind walls of secrecy, still expecting deference based on birth rather than merit. That's an increasingly impossible position to defend. And Harry's legal battle, whatever its technical merits, forced these contradictions into the open. It made people ask questions they hadn't seriously considered before. Why should tabloids be allowed to hack phones with minimal consequences? Why do privacy laws seem to protect ordinary people more effectively than they protect public figures? Why does being famous or royal apparently mean you forfeit basic rights that everyone else takes for granted? These aren't comfortable questions for the British establishment, and Monday's ruling didn't answer them. It just made them louder. According to legal experts who followed this case from the beginning, the court's decision reveals something troubling about how British law treats different classes of people. Not officially, not explicitly, but in practical effect. If you're an ordinary private citizen and someone hacks your phone, the legal system will generally protect you. Criminal charges can be filed, civil damages can be awarded. The law functions as it should. But if you're a public figure, if you're someone the media has decided is newsworthy, those same protections mysteriously evaporate. The standards of proof become impossibly high. The procedural obstacles multiply, and you're effectively told that you accepted this treatment by becoming famous, even if you were born into fame and never had a choice. That's not equal justice under law. That's a two-tier system where your legal protections depend on your public profile, and while Monday's ruling didn't create that system, it certainly reinforced it. The judges essentially confirmed that if you're Prince Harry, if you're someone the tabloids have decided to target, you have fewer enforceable privacy rights than an ordinary person would have in the same situation. That's a remarkable admission from a legal system that claims to treat everyone equally. Now let's talk about the human cost, because that's what gets lost in legal analysis and constitutional debates. There's a man at the center of this story who is genuinely suffering. According to people close to Harry, people who've seen him in private moments away from cameras and public performance, Monday's ruling hit him harder than almost anything since his mother's death. Because it wasn't just about losing a case, it was about the finality of it. The recognition that he'd reached the absolute end of official channels, that there was nowhere left to go within the system, that he'd fought as hard as humanly possible, and it still wasn't enough. Psychologists who specialize in trauma and grief describe something called complicated grief, where loss gets tangled up with anger and injustice in ways that make it almost impossible to process normally. According to these experts, Harry's situation fits that pattern almost perfectly. He's grieving the loss of his case, yes, but he's also grieving the loss of faith in institutions, the loss of his relationship with his family, the loss of his role and identity as a working royal, the loss of his home country in many ways. All of these losses are interconnected and unresolved, creating a psychological burden that would challenge anyone's mental health. And here's what makes it even more complicated. Harry can't grieve privately the way ordinary people can. Every emotion, every reaction, every choice he makes will be scrutinized, analyzed, criticized, and turned into content by the very media institutions he's been fighting against. That creates an impossible situation. He needs space and privacy to process what's happened, but the nature of who he is and what he represents means he'll never get that space. The intrusion that caused the trauma in the first place continues even as he tries to heal from it. That's a vicious cycle that mental health experts say can be absolutely devastating. Some people close to Harry worry genuinely about what comes next for him emotionally and psychologically. They describe someone who's been running on determination and anger for years, using the legal battles as a way to channel pain into purpose. But now that outlet is gone. That structure has collapsed. And what happens when someone who's been defined by fighting suddenly has nothing official left to fight against? According to therapists who work with high-profile individuals, that transition can be incredibly dangerous. It can lead to depression, to destructive behavior, to complete withdrawal from life. The mission that kept you going is suddenly absent, and you're left facing all the pain you'd been outrunning. But there's another possibility, one that some observers think is more likely given Harry's resilience and his track record of transforming pain into purpose. This could become his origin story, not the prince who was born, but the advocate who was created by repeatedly being failed by systems that were supposed to protect him. According to this perspective, Monday's ruling might eventually be seen as the moment Harry stopped being a royal fighting for personal vindication and became something potentially more powerful. A voice for everyone who's been similarly failed by institutions that claim to serve justice. Think about the platform he has if he chooses to use it this way. Millions of people around the world know his name, know his story, and have watched his journey. If he pivoted from personal legal battles to broader advocacy, pushing for legislative reforms around privacy, media accountability, mental health support, and institutional transparency, he could potentially accomplish more than any court victory would have given him. He could turn his individual loss into systemic change that helps millions of people. That would require him to let go of his personal need for vindication and embrace a larger purpose. It's not clear yet whether he's ready or willing to make that shift. According to activists who work on media reform and privacy rights, they would welcome Harry's involvement if he chose that path. His story, his visibility, and his willingness to speak openly about mental health struggles and institutional failures make him a uniquely powerful potential ally. But they also caution that celebrity advocacy can be complicated. It can draw attention to issues, which is valuable. But it can also overshadow the work of people who've been fighting these battles for years without recognition. Harry would need to be thoughtful about how he engaged, listening to experts and affected communities rather than assuming his perspective alone is sufficient. There's also the question of his family and whether any path forward includes potential reconciliation. According to sources close to the royal family, the relationship between Harry and his father, King Charles, is essentially non-existent at this point. They don't speak, messages go unanswered, there's reportedly no ongoing dialogue about anything, let alone about the deeper issues dividing them. The relationship with Prince William is described as even worse, if that's possible. Years of brotherhood and genuine closeness have been replaced by what insiders describe as mutual resentment and complete breakdown of trust. Can those relationships be repaired? According to family therapists who specialize in high conflict situations, reconciliation is theoretically always possible, but it requires things that seem absent here. It requires willingness from both parties to engage honestly. It requires acknowledgement of harm on both sides. It requires a shared desire to move forward that's stronger than the desire to be right or to punish. And crucially, it requires privacy and space away from public pressure and media scrutiny. None of those conditions exist in this situation. Every potential step toward reconciliation would be photographed, analyzed, and turned into headlines that would probably make things worse rather than better. Some royal observers think reconciliation is impossible as long as King Charles remains on the throne. The institutional pressures, the need to protect the monarchy's image, the advisors surrounding Charles who view Harry as a threat rather than family, all of these factors make genuine healing nearly impossible. But others think there might be a window years from now, when Charles is gone and William is king, when enough time has passed and circumstances have changed. That's speculative and uncertain, but it represents a kind of hope that maybe this isn't permanent, maybe families can heal even from wounds this deep. What about Meghan in all of this? According to people who know the couple, she's been Harry's anchor throughout this entire ordeal. She's the one who encouraged him to fight when he wanted to give up. She's the one who believed him when he described surveillance and intrusion that sounded paranoid. She's the one who validated his reality when institutions were gaslighting him. But Monday's ruling affects her too. She's invested years of her life in supporting this battle. She's endured vicious racist attacks from British tabloids. She's been blamed for Harry's choices and painted as the villain who corrupted him. And now this. Some observers worry that Monday's outcome might actually increase the strain on their marriage rather than bringing them closer together. When couples go through intense shared struggles, it can either bond them permanently or create resentment when the struggle ends without victory. Harry might struggle with feelings of failure, with the sense that he dragged his wife through years of public hell for nothing. Meghan might struggle with her own anger at institutions that failed them both. Those aren't easy dynamics to navigate, even in the strongest relationships. Time will tell whether this ordeal ultimately strengthened their bond or created fractures that become apparent only later. Let's talk about Harry's children, because they're part of this story too, even though they're too young to understand it yet. Archie and Lilibet are growing up in California, far from the royal life their father was born into. According to people familiar with Harry and Meghan's parenting philosophy, they're trying desperately to give their children normal childhoods, free from the intrusion and surveillance that defined Harry's youth. But those children will grow up knowing their grandfather is the King of England. They'll eventually learn about their father's legal battles, his estrangement from his family, and the circumstances that led their parents to leave royal life entirely. How will they process that information? Will they resent their parents' choices? Will they be angry that they were cut off from their royal heritage? Or will they understand and appreciate the sacrifices made to protect them? According to child psychologists, those questions won't have clear answers until Archie and Lilibet are much older, perhaps adults themselves. The impact of these decisions will unfold over decades, not years. And Harry and Meghan are essentially making a bet that their children will eventually understand and forgive the complexity of choices made in impossible circumstances. Monday's ruling will be part of that story their children inherit. It will be part of the explanation for why their family is structured the way it is, why they live where they live, why they don't see certain relatives. That's a heavy legacy to pass down, but according to people close to Harry, he believes genuinely that protecting his children from the machine that destroyed his mother and damaged him is worth any cost, including legal defeat, public criticism, and family estrangement. Whether his children will agree with that assessment remains to be seen. So where does this leave us? What's the takeaway from everything we've explored? According to observers who followed this story from the beginning, Monday's ruling represents an ending, yes, but it also represents a beginning, the end of Harry's faith in official systems, but potentially the beginning of something else, something we can't yet define because it hasn't taken shape. Harry now has a choice. He can retreat into private life, which would be entirely understandable. He can escalate his public campaign through non-legal means, which would be dramatic and potentially effective. Or he can try to find some middle path, some way of moving forward that honors his truth without consuming the rest of his life. What we know for certain is that silence won't last forever. Harry is someone who needs to speak, who needs to be heard, who processes trauma by transforming it into narrative. That's what his memoir was. That's what his interviews have been. That's what his legal battles represented. So even if there's silence now, even if he's retreating to process and heal, eventually he'll speak again. And when he does, it will matter. Because he's proven over and over that he's willing to say things others won't, to challenge institutions others defer to break silences others maintain out of fear or propriety. The British monarchy faces a reckoning. Not today, not tomorrow, but it's coming. The institution survived Harry and Meghan's departure. It survived the racism allegations and the Oprah interview. It survived the memoir and the Netflix documentary. But each of these events chipped away at the foundation of deference and automatic respect that monarchy requires to survive. And Monday's ruling, paradoxically, might accelerate that erosion rather than stopping it, because it demonstrated to millions of watching people that even a prince with resources and determination can't get justice when institutions decide to protect themselves instead of seeking truth. That's not a sustainable position for any institution that claims legitimacy. Eventually, enough people lose faith that the entire structure becomes unstable. We might be watching that process unfold in real time, though it will take years or decades to fully play out. The monarchy that exists 50 years from now, if it exists at all, will look fundamentally different than the one we have today. And Harry's story, his battles, and Monday's ruling will be part of that transformation, whether the institution wants to acknowledge it or not. For Prince Harry himself, the path forward remains uncertain, but one thing is clear: the man who walked out of that courtroom Monday is done asking permission, done seeking validation from institutions that repeatedly denied it, done believing the system will save him if he just follows the right procedures. What he becomes instead, what he builds from this wreckage, will define the next chapter not just of his life, but potentially of how we think about privacy, power, and accountability in the modern age. The door slammed Monday. The silence that followed was deafening. But in that silence, something is stirring. Something that institutions should probably be more worried about than they seem to be. Because a prince who stops believing in the system is no longer bound by its rules. And what happens next might be far more disruptive than anything that came before. The story isn't over. It's just beginning. And we'll all be watching to see what Prince Harry does with his hard-won, painful freedom from institutional hope. Whatever it is, it won't be quiet, and it won't be forgettable. The moment has passed, but the reckoning is still coming.